Alright, so we're back with another Hogwarts Legacy video, and today we'll be testing the GTX 1650 Super 4GB in this game. Now, I'm starting off at 720p. We'll try 1080p and 1440p. The reason why I started off at 720p is because of this game's high VRAM requirements. So let's just start our counter there. And as you can see, we are getting a pretty decent frame rate. Now, one thing that I did not mention in my previous video is that system memory usage is extremely high as well. This rig only has 16 gigabytes of DDR4 3200 megahertz CL16 memory. And here you can see we are already using 14 gig. Now, this is at, as I said, 720p. This is on the low preset. So it's a little bit concerning that we've already used 14 gigs of our available 16 gigabytes of memory. Now you can see once we enter the castle, it does begin to stutter a bit, but we are getting pretty decent frame rates from this GPU. Now the reason why I'm testing this is it's actually a direct replacement according to Steam for the 1060. If you are not aware, the 1060 used to be the more popular GPU on Steam, and that has been surpassed by the 1650, the normal one, not the Super. So this one is a bit faster than the normal one. One thing that I must note is that when you play on the low preset, the game doesn't look too bad, but it doesn't look great either. The fuzziness and blurriness in this video is due to the 720p resolution, which is extremely low. But you can see that the frame time graph is actually quite consistent. I tested this on the 6900 XT a bit earlier. A video will follow, and the frame time graph was just all over the place. All right, so that's it for our 720p low. You can see we had an average of 100 frames per second, which is pretty good. We've got a 1% lows of 53, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 38. Now, you can see that we are using about 3.6 gigs of our available 4 gig VRAM. So I expect to run into issues once we start increasing the resolution. Now, one annoying thing about this game, let me just close that, is that you can only select windowed, full screen, or windowed. So, well, what happened? So what actually happens is that you can't change the in-game resolution. You can only change the rendering resolution, right? You have to use upscaling, and then you can change the render resolution. So every time you want to change the resolution in game, you actually have to go back into Windows and change your native desktop resolution. As you can see, this is the recommended settings for this GPU. So that was low. Let's try medium, and immediately we do get a warning that this exceed the recommended settings for our hardware. Who cares? All right, I just reset the numbers there. Our performance did not decrease that much, maybe 10-15%, depending on where we are. Well, there we go. That dropped down to the mid 60s there. I'm just a bit concerned about the VRAM. Now we can actually see that the system memory is reducing the system memory usage, which is pretty strange. Maybe this game does have a memory leak of some kind. Not sure yet. It's still early days. I mean, the game hasn't officially launched yet. I'm only able to make these videos because I've got the deluxe version, and that gives you 3 days early access. I mean, all in all, this performance is definitely acceptable. I'm not sure what to expect from this GPU at all. I just started off with 720p. As I said, I had some concerns with regards to the VRAM, so we'll definitely up the resolution to 1080p. I'm pretty sure we won't even be able to play at 1440p, but hey, we need to test it. Alright, so at 1080p medium, we got an average of 86 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 46, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 34. Let's try the high presets. Alright, we are now on the high preset, and I did notice quite a lot of texture pop-in. It took quite a while for the scene to fully render, but it seems that once it does, the performance seems okay. We more or less halved our performance here. We went from around 80 frames per second to around 40 frames per second. So I think maybe just play on the medium preset if you've got a 1650 Super. Once again, in the castle here, the frame time graph does become a lot more inconsistent. It's definitely not unplayable. It's not game breaking at this point. When you go to Hogsmeade, which is the town just up the road, the stuttering does increase a bit on, especially on higher end GPUs, and it's because we become a bit more CPU bound when there's a lot of people in the town. The AI seems to be a bit taxing. All right, I must say that I am pleasantly surprised. Sure, it's only at 720p. Maybe I shouldn't be, but getting around 60 frames per second, depending which direction you're looking at. So if we look north, we get around 50 frames per second. If we look south, then we get above 60 frames per second. So maybe just play facing south all the time. You can actually do that by playing the game like this. There we go. So there's some decent tick tips for you. All right, that's it for our 720p high testing. We've got an average of 60 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 35, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 25. Now let's see what happens at ultra. I'm not holding my breath. All right, we're now on the ultra preset, and I'm not sure we'll be able to play this game at this preset. You can see we are dropping below 20 frames per second, even. Not ideal. I'm not going to be using FSR at all at 720p, just purely because it's pointless. If you want a higher frame rate, then just reduce the graphical preset. The resolution is so low anyway. By decreasing the internal resolution, it'll just make the game look a lot worse. Once again, inside the castle here, you can see that the frame time graph becomes a very inconsistent. At least we're getting about 70 frames per second inside, which is good. Just a pity that most of the gameplay happens outside, but inside the game is definitely still playable. Outside, the game feels okay even at 30 frames per second. So I mean, if you've got a 1650 Super, you really can't be too disappointed in the performance. Just avoid the ultra preset. I mean, that goes for most GPUs and most games. The games look perfectly fine at high. Some even look very good at medium. So just be realistic in your expectations and choose appropriately. All right, so it's 720p ultra. We had an average of 35 frames per second. Our 1% lows are sitting at 17, and our 0.1% lows are sitting at 14. Now, don't let that frame rate average fool you. You don't get a constant 30 frames per second experience. It does seem to be a bit better now. Previously, when we rolled off of that ledge here, we dipped into the 20s, and now it seems to hold its own at around 30. So maybe it was just some textures still loading. All right, so now let's see what happens at 1080p. All right, we're now at 1080p on the low preset, and immediately the game looks a lot better than at 720p for obvious reasons, and the game seems to perform quite okay. We are still getting above 60 frames per second at this point. It might go lower depending on which area you are in, but this is a pretty demanding area, especially closer to these woods. If you go into the Forbidden Forest, the frame rate would drop a bit, but obviously we can't test every single area. Going into the castle here, the stuttering seems to be a bit less than at the previous setting. It might be that we are more GPU bound now, so a lot less chance of a CPU bottleneck holding us back. You can have a look at the GPU usage there at the top. You've got it's sitting at about 95% at the moment, right? So it does go down to the high 90s, or the low 90s, sorry. So it goes down to 91, 92 at times. That's still perfectly fine. Ideally, you'd want it at 95 and above. That would mean that you are not CPU limited. All right, so that's it for 1080p low. We've got an average of 67 frames per second, 1% lows of 43, and 0.1% lows of 34. Let's try the medium preset. All right, we're now at 1080p medium. The game looks quite a bit better. We did see a lot of texture pop in. The level took about 10 seconds to fully load. But as I mentioned earlier, around 45 frames per second still feels pretty good in this game. You don't need a high refresh rate experience. Obviously, it'll be nice to have one. It'll be ideal to have above 60 frames per second. But for that, you would obviously need to play at 1080p low or 720p. The stuttering does seem to have increased quite a bit just by going to the medium preset. Yeah, I'm just running the same path. Once again, this is just to give you an idea of how the game performs on certain hardware. If we had to make videos on every single area, these videos would be like 40 hours long. All right, I must say that this was actually not a bad experience, except for the increased stuttering. We got an average of 53 frames per second, 1% lows sitting at 33, and 0.1% lows of 16. That said, this game is not without its issues. If you haven't seen it yet, go look at my 6600 XT video. The game very early runs out of VRAM the moment you start enabling ray tracing. And yeah, you can also see that we are sitting at around 13 gigabytes of system memory usage, and that also creeps up over time. Right, let's see what it does at the high preset. So I'm just going to leave it there. You can see that the textures take forever to load in the foliage. There we go. There's still some parts missing. One thing that I need to say though is the VRAM usage is staying at about 3.5 gigs or VRAM allocation. Actually, that's not true usage. There's still some things that didn't fully load in yet. That said, with the higher end cards, when ray tracing is enabled, as soon as you hit the VRAM limit, the game just becomes unplayable. And over here, it seems like performance does decrease, but it doesn't become unplayable. Well, yet. For some reason, our VRAM allocation is going down and then it's going up again. There wasn't a patch that I'm aware of, so don't think anything was patched since my last video, which was done last night. But if you're okay with a 30 frames per second gameplay experience, then even at 1080p high with the 1650 Super, you'd be able to achieve that. Inside, our frame rate is not nearly as high as it was. What's happening here? Oh, that's just unacceptable. Thought this was a game for kids. Now, compared to our average during our previous settings, the frame rate inside was quite a bit higher. Over here, it seemed to even out a bit, but outside we are still getting around 35 frames per second, which in my mind is playable. I wouldn't necessarily play like this, but if you do have a 1650 Super and you do care about visuals, then this is maybe a setting that you can consider. We obviously can also use FSR, but that'll come a bit later. All right, so there we have it for 1080p high. We've got an average of 42 frames per second, 1% lows are setting at 27, and 0.1% lows are setting at 24. Let's try the Ultra preset. Right, once again, I'm just going to leave this here. You can see that the textures load pretty slowly. The world gets populated very slowly. The performance is definitely lacking. Don't think we should be playing at Ultra. And it does seem like not everything has loaded in yet. Right now, this frame rate is even higher than what we got on the 6600 XT when ray tracing was enabled and we ran out of VRAM. I'm not sure if you can see the ghosting, but there's a lot of ghosting in the character there. Not sure if that's intentional or not. Seeing that he's a wizard. But all right, so on Ultra, this is definitely a VRAM limitation. You can see that the game speeds up every now and again, like it slows down completely and then it speeds up. So I think we are hitting our VRAM limit with the Ultra preset. Don't think you should be playing on Ultra anyway. FSR unfortunately does not help that much when you run into VRAM limitations. Not entirely sure why, because usually lowering the internal resolution helps quite a lot with VRAM usage. It's just that these textures on Ultra are just extremely detailed. And I just want to see what happens once we go inside. Then we'll switch back to 1080p high and start using FSR. You can see that I mean, the stuttering is not as noticeable purely because we are starting off with a very low frame rate anyway, right? But inside we didn't seem to have it our VRAM limitation, but outside I think if we play for a little bit longer, it will definitely come into play. All right, so let's just switch to 1080p high and see what FSR setting we need to use to get a constant 60 frames per second. Right, we're back on the high preset and still struggling with this controller here. So let's just go to FSR 2. So this game supports FSR 1, 2, Intel XeSS, Nvidia NIS, and DLSS, as well as frame generation. So you've got quite a few choices when it comes to upscaling, especially if you've got an Nvidia card, then you can make use of all of them. All right, so FSR 2 quality, I think we might need to go to balanced, but let's see what happens. Just going to reset our numbers here, and once again textures take a while to load in. before we come to a conclusion with regards to performance, I'm just going to wait for everything to load in. And I don't think that our performance increased that much by going to FSR Quality. So the high preset seems to be demanding, and it's easy to see why. The game looks good. But yeah, we're not going to see 60 frames per second with these settings. All right, let's try FSR Balanced. See, we're still in the 40s to 50 range, even though we are now on FSR Balanced. It doesn't seem to have helped our performance a whole lot here. Let me just reset the numbers there. We are getting a bit closer to that 60 frames per second, but still short of it. Percentage-wise, it's a long way to go. Around 20% performance increase that we need to get to 60 frames per second. So not sure if the high preset would be worth it. I think your best bet with a 1650 Super is just to play a 1080p medium, and there we saw that natively you were able to almost get a constant 60 frames per second. Alright, but just for giggles, let's see how this game performs at FSR Performance. Right, we're now running at FSR Performance, and for the first time there we saw 60. It's not a constant 60 FPS. We are definitely better off just going back to the medium preset. And if you really want to make sure that you get a constant 60 frames per second, let's do FSR Quality. So I'm just going to leave this here. This is with 1080p FSR Performance. Lowering the internal resolution is more detrimental to the visual quality than just going down one preset. So unless you are happy with 1080p 30 FPS, then just avoid the high preset as well. All right, let's try the medium preset this time with FSR. Right, we're now on the medium preset, and FSR Quality is now back. Let's see if we can maintain that a magical 60 FPS. Just going to reset the numbers here. And it looks okay. You can see that the textures this time didn't take as long to load in, and so far it's okay. We did drop below 60 there just for once, and inside, well, we are maintaining that 60 frames per second, obviously because the game is not as demanding inside as outside. It's just that the stuttering increases. So it's quite funny. Inside, the stuttering is extreme, but the frame rates are pretty high. And outside, the frame rates are pretty low, but almost no stuttering. Just running back to my starting point. If you do see some tearing in the screen there, it's just my capture card. It does capture screen tearing as well, just because I'm not using a variable refresh rate on the capture card itself. I'm just setting it to 60 FPS capture, so that's why you see the screen tearing. Alright, so at 1080p medium with FSR Quality, we were able to mostly maintain a 60 frames per second experience. We've got an average of 71, we've got a 1% low sitting at 41, and 0.1% low sitting at 31. I'm just going to do one test at 1440p. Let's see how it goes. Alright, we're now at 1440p. We're back on the low preset. Yeah, you can see that TIA is low and we don't have any FSR enabled. Let's see how it goes. Alright, here we are at 1440p. I've got the low preset enabled, no FSR. And just look at that system memory usage. We are sitting at 15.2 gigabytes. So I think the time has come for 32 gigabytes to be more prominent, especially in future AAA titles. It might still be an optimization thing. Maybe after a few optimization patches, this might be sorted. Don't know. I won't hold my breath. We are still getting around 40 frames per second, and we are not yet running out of VRAM, so which is pretty good. So if you do have a 1440p monitor and you, for some unfortunate reason, paired it with a 1650 Super, you can still play this game at around 40 frames per second. You can see that now that we are definitely a lot more GPU bound, the 1% and 0.1% lows are very close to the average, and that's what you want. Inside, it might be a different story. Let's see. So you can see that the 0.1% lows suffer a bit. That's just because of the stuttering inside, obviously. But so far, I'm actually quite impressed with this GPU's performance at 1440p. Sure, 40 frames per second is nothing to write home about, but as I mentioned earlier, if you do have a 1440p panel, then you can at least still play this game acceptably. Let's just see what happens once we enable FSR. I'm just going to go straight ahead to FSR Balanced, but then again, this is now on the low preset, so we might be able to get 60 frames per second. Right, so we got FSR Balanced enabled now, and I'm just going to reset our numbers here. And look at that, we might be able to at least get close to having a constant 60 FPS here. Sure, once again, if you go to different areas, the frame rate will drop, it will change. Some areas will be a lot higher, some areas will be a lot lower. I'm just using this particular scene because it's close to Hogwarts, and just want to demonstrate that once you enter the building, the stuttering starts, which is annoying. But and outside, it's quite demanding as well. Might not be the most demanding scene, but it's demanding enough to get an idea. All right, so FSR Balanced seems to do the job, yeah. I'm quite impressed. I think this would be acceptable. We're getting almost 60 frames per second. The detail, the visuals look pretty good still, even though we are now rendering internally at a much lower resolution. Nice thing about this game is it actually shows you what it's rendering at, so I don't have to keep on guessing anymore. Right, so if we go into this bar here, so we are rendering at 848p. I messed up our performance metrics there by going into the menu, but hopefully you got a pretty good idea of what to expect. All right, and that's it for our GTX 1650 Super video in Hogwarts Legacy. Hope you guys enjoyed this video. If you did, hit that like button, hit that subscribe button, and as always, we hope to see you in the next one.